A report from Group 17 by Robert C. O'Brien, Chapter 22. Imagine a weapon, Fergus continued, so gentle, so painless, so quiet that no enemy would ever suspect it was being used against him. A weapon which kills no one, makes no one sick, and produces no detectable physical symptoms, no discernible medical disorders in its victims. He stared at the fire and puffed his pipe, sitting with his legs outstretched, speaking softly as if to himself. Well, Mr. Bales said, it doesn't sound very dangerous. On the contrary, it would be the most dangerous form of attack ever conceived. There would be no defense against it, because no one would know there was anything to defend against. I read a science fiction story once, Fergus continued, addressing the fire. An extraterrestrial enemy was attacking the Earth. The human race? Attacking? They didn't use any weapons at all. Not in the proper sense. Instead, they put up harmless little buildings near all the population centers. When they pushed the button, all the buildings gave off a humming noise, not unpleasant, but pervasive. All the same pitch, and everybody in the world could hear it. The idea was to get everybody's nervous system vibrating on the same wavelength and then transmit orders, thoughts, ideas on that frequency. Ingenious. No bloodshed, no pain, no tears, Colonel Attenborough said. And no resistance. As you said, not really a weapon at all. Strictly, Fergus said, maybe you can't call what shoots has a weapon either. Then what do you call it? Mr. Bales sounded mildly irritated. What exactly does he have? If it doesn't hurt anyone, what harm does it do? What are the symptoms? Take the last point first. Fergus walked the length of the room and came back carrying the English translation of Diaz Rodriguez's journal. Do you remember this part? It's the old man as he dies describing what happened to the people in the Steinkampf Valley. They were not ill, the old man insisted. No one was stricken with fever or pain or cough or sores on the skin. At first, it was noticed only that they talked less and laughed less. They had been used to sing in the evenings, and sometimes dance, and now they neither sang nor danced at all. They slept long and sat and looked at nothing. When their roofs leaked and needed thatch, they did not mend them. When the weeds choked their gardens, they did not pull them up. All of this did not happen at once, but over years, perhaps even 2 generations. Then the men of my house, my great-grandfather and his brothers and sons, feared that these people, who were most of those in our valley, would suffer and starve, so they ordered them, mend your roofs, and they did as they were told. Cultivate your gardens, and they did. But they only did as they were told, and little else. Each generation grew worse. So, said Colonel Attenborough, the symptoms. Fergus closed the book and looked at the fire again. What we have is a total lack of physiological symptoms. The disease, the syndrome, as Dr. Schutz calls it, manifests itself socially. In a primitive mountain village, unthatched roofs and untended gardens were the first noticeable signs. But what would you look for in a modern, complex, mechanized society? Let's suppose, as all his reports indicate, that the doctor has a dosage worked out very precisely, and let's say that whoever uses the weapon has the intelligence to grasp its greatest value, its total lack of detectability. Thus, we assume it is applied in its mildest, subtlest form. What would we, as victims, notice? Or more likely, not notice? Perhaps at first, minor malfunction in the most complex workings of our society. Our 2 biggest single machines are the telephone system and our electric power network. Both are highly automated, yet both demand constant human attendance. Maybe one day, 1 month, 1 year, they begin not to work as well as they used to. Our biggest factories mass-produce automobiles. Maybe the intricate machinery of mass production begins to go wrong. The automobiles emerge defective, bolts left loose, wiring wrong, parts installed incorrectly. Somehow the factory workers and inspectors can't seem to keep up with their jobs anymore, or they just don't care. Whatever the disease hits, I think the deterioration would show up more acutely and quickly in the most intricately complex areas, the big cities. Those are possibilities. In any case, they'd be the start of a slow creeping degeneration. I think we'd see a general slackness, in dress perhaps, in promptness, in neatness. Relief rolls would rise, so would absenteeism, There'd be a decline in productivity per man-hour, which would be duly noted by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. But here's the frightening part of it, probably not noted otherwise. Not internally, not by the people to whom it's happening. Oh, there'd be some outcries at first, probably, but they wouldn't amount to much, because of course the people who should be making the outcries would be suffering from the same malaise themselves. No, not suffering, but afflicted nonetheless. They wouldn't really see what was going on because they'd be part of it. But the decline would be highly visible, and fascinating to watch from across the sea, from whatever alien group is applying the treatment. The leader nation, its telephone system would remain efficient, its machines would run smoothly. How greatly in demand its exported cars would become, and, in the end, its exported engineers, plant managers, technical advisors, leaders. There would be no struggle in this conquest, just as there is no struggle in the Steinkamp Valley. It would be very quiet, very gentle and gradual. Maybe that's the most beautiful thing about it, from his point of view. A bit in the water supply here and there. He doesn't have to infect everybody. 1 or 2% will do. It will spread from there. Fergus paused in his quiet soliloquy, and Mr. Bales stirred. Eloquent, reasonable, horrifying, but all is yet hypothesis. You haven't told us what Dr. Schutz's weapon is. To be credible, to be real, to be applied, it's got to have a physical form. Fergus laughed, but did not sound amused. I have not, and, for the soundest of reasons, I don't know. All I have is a wild guess, and I'm not sure I believe it myself. Colonel Attenborough looked incredulous. But surely, in all his written research, Schutz must indicate what it is he's working with. A virus, a bacterium, a protozoan? Fergus added, or a protein molecule, or an amino acid, or an enzyme. There's quite a list of possibilities. Some we can eliminate, of course. For example, a protozoan is unlikely. It's just too big an animal, too detectable, too vulnerable. Remember, it's got to get through a water purification system, and it can't show up in normal analysis. But the fact is, all the research Schutz did in those first months or years when he was studying the water to find out what he had, what was in it, we haven't a shred of material on that. By the time the Russians got him, that work was done, complete. In his Group 17 reports, when he refers to the substance at all, which he does as seldom as possible, he uses only the symbol SK, an abbreviation, I assume, for Steinkampf. So we don't know what he discovered, or even, in fact, if he himself ever learned what it was. It's perfectly possible to work with something, to learn what it will do, without ever knowing what it is. Magnetism, for example, or gravity. Colonel Attenborough said, or a filterable virus. Filterable, undoubtedly, but not necessarily a virus. In fact, I'm betting that it's not. The name of the game, Fergus added, is cytogenetics. The pieces you play with are mutagens, definitions, the science of manipulating cell growth right at the core, the nucleus, the chromosomes, the genes, the DNA, and the so-called messenger RNA. A mutagen can be animal, vegetable, mineral, a particle of energy, a photon of light. But there's one big difference in classification of mutagens. Some are classed as somatic. They affect cell structure and growth of an organism for one generation only and then die out. Cancer is one of these. One of many. Mostly they're believed to be caused by viruses or subviruses, and they're not inheritable. But other mutagens affect the germ cells. And if they're not fatal at an early age, they're passed on from one generation to the next. Dr. Schutz has a mutagen that does both. That is, it's somatic, it affects the organism immediately, but it's also inheritable. The immediate effect seems to be on the brain cells, and through them on the psyche, the personality, hence the lassitude, the decline of initiative, both in the Steinkamp Valley people and in his laboratory subjects. The effect is one he can regulate, but the genetic effect, the children, the second generation, he can't. All his notes indicate that the syndrome shows up more strongly in the offspring than in the parents. As the old man said to Diaz Rodriguez, and each generation grew worse. Judging by all this, And by other hints in his notes, I think Dr. Schutz didn't find a virus or a bacterium in that bottle from the Steinkopf Valley. What kind of hints? One kind in particular. A lot of his measurements seem to deal with specific gravity. He is concerned with weight and density. You don't ordinarily measure viruses that way, nor the bacteria count in water. What do you measure that way? Something where specific gravity makes a crucial difference, a substance where the chemical structure is familiar, but the density is different, where the elements are all there in the right proportions, but the behavior has changed. Fergus looked at Colonel Attenborough. You work with biochemists. Doesn't that sound familiar? A polymer, said the Colonel. Dr. Schutz's bottle contained no new germs, but it did contain a new kind of water. Polywater, exclaimed the Colonel. Of course, water 2, or maybe water 3, or better still, for the time being, call it water X. Somewhere in his early testing, Dr. Schutz made a startling discovery. Although Steinkopf water seemed quite pure, it weighed about twice as much as it ought to. Fergus tapped the dottle out of his pipe on a log in the fireplace. Every chemistry student knows what water is. The molecule is one oxygen atom, two hydrogen atoms, H2O. That is, they knew it until 1962, when a group of Russians at the USSR Academy of Sciences discovered that it wasn't necessarily so. Until then, water was a constant. It was the basis for the metric system of weights and measures. 1 cubic centimeter of water weighed exactly 1 gram. That's what a gram meant. I believe the story is that a Russian physicist worked in one of their research centers in northern Siberia, looked out the window at some winter wheat waving in the wind. It occurred to him that it shouldn't be waving, it should be snapping off. The temperature was below zero, hadn't been above zero for months, and the green wheat stalks, like all grasses, contained more than 50% water. Why didn't it freeze? Why weren't the stalks brittle? He gathered some of the wheat, extracted the water, and discovered the reason. It wasn't ordinary water at all. It had changed. Its density was 50% greater than normal water, and its molecules had polymerized. That is, they were multiple molecules. Instead of one oxygen and two hydrogen atoms, they had formed long chains, written not H2O, but H8O4 or H32O16 or even higher. Hence the name polywater. It doesn't freeze until it gets down to minus 40 degrees, doesn't boil until 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The upshot, after quite a lot of lab work in Moscow, was a scientific paper announcing the discovery of water 2. American physicists disputed it, and the argument is still going on. One result is that water as a substance is getting more study than ever before, and all kinds of new things are cropping up. For instance, some biologists think it also changes its structure when it's enclosed in certain animal cells, red blood cells, for instance. What nobody realized until here and now is that Helmut Schutz started this same research in 1937. He's 35 years ahead of everybody else. Interesting coincidence, Colonel Attenborough said. The Russians saw the grass waving in the Siberian breeze. And didn't Diaz Rodriguez mention the lichen waving in the wind up in the Altiplano, where it also stays frozen 6 or 7 months a year? That occurred to me too. What I've been thinking is that an earthquake, back in the time of the old man's great-great-grandfather, diverted a mountain stream into an ancient bed of those lichens. They were dead and compacted like peat, but they were still loaded with molecules of the altered water. The stream emerged from the mountainside as a waterfall, and a village and a valley went to sleep. Mr. Bales concluded. All right, I'm with you so far, but there's still a puzzle. Schutz has his bottle of water X. He's got his own laboratory. Over the next 5 or 6 years, he finds out what it will do. But then the Russians come in. They blow up his lab. They capture him. Then what? Can you imagine the Russian army intelligence and then the secret police searching him, interrogating him, moving him from a prisoner of war camp to a Siberian research center, all the while letting him carry his little bottle of polywater? How did he keep it? How did he keep it secret? There's only one way he could have done it, Fergus said. His notes show that in small enough quantities, below the concentration he indicates as 5, Water X has no discernible effect on the subject's behavior. When the Russians were closing in, he took the gamble. He had to. Not such a desperate gamble, perhaps, because he already had the ratios pretty well worked out. He injected a few micrograms of Water X in a weak solution into his own arm. He became, in effect, what doctors call a carrier. When he needed it, all he had to do was draw a sample of his own blood, and it would be enough Water X, and in it would be enough Water X, or SK as he calls it, to serve as the nucleus of a new supply. A few molecules would do. How does he make more? Simple enough. Since what he's got is a molecule, not a crystal, not a living organism, it doesn't reproduce itself except in a roundabout way. Nonetheless, easily done. When Water X is metabolized into a living cell, when it locks onto the molecular structure of the chromosomes and the cell divides, the characteristics of the water are present in both the new cells. In other words, he feeds it to a culture. As the culture grows, so does his supply of polywater. He doesn't specify just what the culture is. He may have found half a dozen or more that will work. But that's why he always needs and lists so many petri dishes, so many more than he normally need in his BW research. But who counts petri dishes? They're a dime a dozen. So, said the colonel, he not only has the weapon, he is the weapon, the only available source. Almost, Fergus said, but not quite. I've never hoped so hard that I'm wrong, but I think there is now another source. The girl, said Mr. Bales. We can't just knock on the door and tell them, we know you've got her in there, let her out, because, for one, we don't know they've got her in there. We only think they have. Worse than that, said the colonel, if Fergus is right. They don't know they've got her in there. We can make a formal protestation, Mr. Bales said. We'll have to go through the State Department, but if we do, they'll make a formal denial, and their indignation will be genuine. Fergus asked, can't we tell them that we know Schutz is working there? I mean, maybe not official proof, but good enough to convince them we do know? Probably, said Mr. Bales. But it's the last thing we want to do. You know what the result would be. At worst, nothing at all. Only more denial. At best, they'd spirit Dr. Schutz out of there, out of the country and back to Siberia in a matter of hours. And if they found there was a girl there, they'd spirit her right along with him, or get rid of her in some less pleasant way. This is the KGB. They're not nice guys. In either case, we'd gain nothing, and I hate to think of what we'd lose. We'd blow the cover off every agent we have between here and Novokuznetsk. Our biological warfare intelligence network would be wiped out. 25 years of work. I'd do it in a minute, Fergus said cheerfully, if it would get the girl out. Your agents know the risk they take, but the girl didn't. She was kidnapped, and she's only 12 years old. Mr. Bales sighed. You're right. I suppose I would too, but the point is, it wouldn't get her out. It would almost certainly get her killed. The real point is, said the colonel, what do we do? Fergus stood up and looked at his watch. It was 3 minutes past 5. Officially, there's nothing we can do, but as of now, I resign my job as a paid consultant. I have, therefore, no further connection with the U.S. government. As a private citizen, I'm going to do some trespassing on Russian soil. I'm going to try to get Alice and Adam out. Colonel Attenborough said, Alone? No, I have a friend. If you listen, I think you'll hear his car coming up the drive. When he gets here, I will ask you to excuse us. You have no official knowledge of our plans. And that is the end of Chapter 22.